Thousands of unpaid carers have been hit with fines due to falling foul of earnings rules. Some of them have also faced prosecutions for infringement of the earning threshold. Department of Work and Pension is recovering the overpayment of carers allowance from their existing benefit or from their salaries. Is the current benefit system therefore fit for purpose? And what does it mean for those who are already stuck with paying their debt to the state? Welcome to Debt Talk podcast with me, your host, Ripon Ray. This time I'm speaking about carers and benefit overpayment. To explore this subject in detail, I have Rory Ewan, Senior Analyst from Policy and Practice, Abhay Jitendra, Senior Policy Advisor from Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Joseph Rowntree Foundation have written a report on carers and how they're impacted financially in Britain. My panel members are also to provide Debt Talk listeners with top tips for those who are genuinely considering laying the seed for policy change on this precise subject. Let me start with Rory Ewan from Policy and Practice to give an overview. So Rory, in Britain, what do we mean by a carer?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ripon. It's great to talk about a commonly under-discussed and under-recognised role in society. If we first look at the actual definition of what a carer is, it is quite broad. So it's anyone, including children and adults, who look after a family member, partner or friend who needs help because of an illness, disability, mental health problem or an addiction, and they cannot cope without their support. The carers I think we're talking about today are probably the informally they're unpaid, so they don't work for a care organisation, but they're doing it for someone they know. And this could be inclusive of both adults and young carers. It's important that this definition is quite broad, and it recognises that the common nature of the relationship between someone who is a carer and who they're caring for is quite fluid, and that it can mean that often people don't recognise that they are in fact a carer. What we commonly mean when we talk about carers in relation to the welfare system is someone in receipt of either carers allowance or someone in receipt of carers allowance of universal credit. And these are benefits that people can claim if they meet eligibility criteria to help them with living costs and to help them pay for when they care for their people that they care for.
So what does the data around carers say about the state of carers in the UK?
Yeah, definitely. So, in short, a significant proportion of carers are struggling financially in the UK. If this is sort of broken down into three main areas, probably due to the ongoing cost of living crisis, and obviously bills increasing, the level of support they can get for caring, so the amount they get through carers allowance or the care element of universal credit and other means tested benefits, and other factors such as their ability to work and earn other income from things like earnings or anything like that. I think the charity Carers UK suggested at the end of 2023 that there could be up to 10.6 million people caring who are currently providing unpaid care for people. And it includes an estimated 2.5 million people who've given up their work to care, which means that they are wholly reliant on either savings or just income from their welfare systems, such as carers allowance. As with a lot of other households in the UK, the cost of living has had a very large impact on carers. Also just because of normal bills going up and down, but also because of the additional costs that comes with people with disabilities and with caring for people, means that they often have to pay more for sort of things like electricity, gas, anything else like that people may need for their disability or health conditions, and means that they're hit particularly hard by things like rising energy costs and things like that. Previous JRF research did find that the rate of poverty for carers in receipt of carers allowance has doubled in the past 10 years. So it really shows how in the past 10 years, both the level of support carers are getting isn't adequate enough to give people the support they need, and also how the cost of living has risen quite drastically for this group of people.
You mentioned about financial challenges, but is there any other challenges that they seem to face in this country?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say probably financial challenges, I think, are the challenges that carers face most. Obviously, the limited number of income they can get from things like carers allowance, and also the eligibility criteria which is placed on them through carers allowance, and the limits that puts on where they can get income from, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But I think something else which also is really impacting carers is the amount of care they're giving to people. In the recent 2021 census, found that there's been an increase in the proportion of people providing over 50 hours of care per week, which is, an incredibly large amount of care to give to someone. the carers allowance eligibility criteria means that you only have to give 35 hours, which is sort of a standard work week. So 50 hours is really a lot of care to be giving to someone over the course of a week, and really means that for people who are caring this quite large proportion of time, they really don't have time to focus on their own well-being or focus on themselves, which means that they can get into maybe quite hard times of just focusing on caring and not having time to focus on their own well-being and health.
You briefly talked about carers receiving carers allowance and
Yeah.
universal credit. And if they do get paid, what other payments can they get apart from carers allowance and universal credit?
Yeah, definitely. So carers, they don't get paid for in the formal sense of working for a care agency or something like that. That falls into a different category of carer. So they are unpaid in that sense. They are recognised through the Carers Act in 2014, which is one of the most recent pieces of legislation regarding carers, which says that they should get support through legislation. But it is commonly voluntarily that carers do fall into or sort of go into caring for people, commonly through either family members or friends that either fall into hard times that they need to start caring for them. So it is voluntary, and it's normally through the relationship that they have with the person that they're caring for.
In terms of, let's say, the emotional strain the carers have to go through, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I used to work for Citizens Advice before I moved over to policy and practice, which often meant working with people on the front line. And it's obvious from sort of supporting people as much as you can that the emotional strain that they have is very, very large, because they're having to care not just for themselves, so they're having to think firstly about the person they're caring for. So what care do they give to that person? What support do they give? How do they ensure that they live the best life they can? They're also having to think about their own struggles, so their own payments for bills and everything else like that they may be struggling with financially. So it really does show the emotional toll that it takes through having to think about lots of things at once.
So in terms of knowing that there are emotional constraints, what forms of help can they get? Will local governments or central governments can provide some forms of emotional support to overcome the burden?
I believe there are sort of groups that people can join if with sort of fellow carers to sort of discuss what emotional strain they have. That might be through local authorities. Central government, I don't believe, provide any sort of emotional support really outside of sort of the financial support. So it probably is local groups that they can find to sort of to connect with other carers and sort of discuss the issues that they're facing.
So where does the current controversy come in when they are overpaid, resulting in recovery of overpayment of benefits, and most importantly, they're even being prosecuted?
Yes, definitely. So if we look at the eligibility criteria for carers allowance, one of the main criteria is obviously that the person they're caring for must be in receipt of a disability benefit. So this can be things like personal dependence payment for someone if they're caring who's working age, attendance allowance if they're pension age, and other things like the disability living allowance and other things like that. On the actual carer, there are some constraints as well. Some of these relate to the amount of caring they have to do, which is 35 hours, as I mentioned before. Some is age related, such as they must be at least 16 or they must be not in full-time education. But the main one, which is sort of impacting people at the moment, is the earnings constraint. So this means that carers are only allowed to earn up to £151 a week at the moment to be eligible for carers allowance. And it's obviously, some people might not be aware of that, or they might not know exactly how much they're earning per week. But because it's a strict threshold, which means that if you earn just £1 over, you lose eligibility completely. This means that some people can earn and can get quite large overpayments from earning just very slightly over the threshold. So if you earn £152, rather than your carers allowance reducing by £1, you lose entitlement to it all. So what this means is that if you earn £52 a year over the threshold, it can mean that you can have an overpayment of £4,258 from the whole carers allowance you earned in that year. And obviously, with people's earnings being up and down, with the emotional constraint that people have caring for people, might not be aware, firstly, of what the rules are and the eligibility criteria. They might not be aware of where their change of circumstances means that they've gone over this threshold. And also because of the lack of sort of information they get from the DWP, it can mean that they go quite a long time before they realise that they've been overpaid, or before the DWP sort of looks into their case and realises, oh, actually, you've not been eligible for quite a long time. In terms of the DWP's role in this, I think the current figures show there's about 134,000 carers repaying a total of about 250 million, which means that I think about 11,500 are paying back over £5,000 in carers allowance. And now the DWP has obviously a role in this. They go forward and they've obviously been shown to prosecute people. And it shows how the DWP sort of see themselves. The DWP do see themselves as obviously being the body which is responsible for giving people correct payments that they're eligible for in that time. But this does mean that when people do have overpayments, they're quite strict and they're quite straight to the rules around how they prosecute people and how they follow people for these overpayments. I think this is sort of a two-part problem. First, and maybe in terms of the DWP, in terms of the lack of flexibility they show for these people in overpayments, but also the carers allowance system itself. Because of this very strict threshold, it means that overpayments can go quite high quite quickly from very slight changes in earnings. If we look at universal credit, for example, that has a taper rate. So rather than you losing eligibility for the whole universal credit award over a certain amount of earnings, they decrease for 55p for every £1 you earn. And it maybe is just the carers allowance system and the lack of flexibility in that, as well as the DWP, which maybe needs to have some improvements made.
But going deeper into it, there's a difference between recovering overpayment and actually prosecution, where you're literally told that you are a fraudster.
Definitely, yeah. No, there's completely a difference between just overpayments and prosecution, and I think it does fall down to the sort of DWPs, how they see themselves, which is being that enforcement body to make sure that people get paid the correct amount at the correct time on their eligibility criteria. But it does mean that when these payments do get quite large, they sort of see it as sort of they need to recover that because it is an incorrect payment made. Which means that they can go, obviously, not just to the overpayment, but to the prosecution, which can lead to some horrific cases like we've been seeing about people going to court and things like that.
But in terms of, let's say, carers' point of view, I mean, what remedies do they have when they find themselves in that situation?
Definitely, yeah. So the first thing I would say is that if a carer is facing a situation like this, that there is support available for you. You don't have to go through this all yourself. There's local advice centres like Citizens Advice and other things like that who can support you in this. When someone is faced with a situation of an overpayment, that you can challenge it. So there's something called a mandatory reconsideration, where you ask them to reconsider the decision. And that's where, if you believe that the overpayment is incorrect, you can challenge it and maybe get it overturned. If it is correct, you can look to negotiate with the DWP. If you find that the repayments they're offering you are too high, you can get support and see if you can negotiate with them a sustainable repayment plan or anything like that to make sure that you're not left in a situation which is unsustainable.
Thank you, Rory. Let me get Abby Jitendra, Senior Policy Advisor from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, into the conversation. Abby, what is your initial thought from what you've heard from Rory?
So I think it's just really tragic for carers because, as we found through successive research that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has done, many carers are in poverty. They're disproportionately in poverty compared to the wider population. And it's not a surprise why. As Rory says, many leave work to care, which means you don't have as much to live on. And then the social and social security safety net is just not robust enough to actually even cover the cost of essentials. So it's not that surprising that if carers allowance is your main source of income, or one of your main sources of income, you don't have enough to live on. And I think that's why carer groups and others are so sort of upset about this particular overpayment issue, because really people are obviously annoyed about the administrative problems that are leading to these overpayments and the heavy-handed collection of the debt. But really, it's a much bigger problem with how we value unpaid care in our society and the way that carers are treated, not only by the government and systems, but society at large.
Abby, you've carried out a number of research, but before we go deeper into it, I mean, tell me a bit about the motive behind the research. What was the purpose of carrying out the research?
So at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we want a future free from poverty, and we want to move to a system where you have a much more just system, which means less poverty, but also more broadly systems that really work for people. And care is a really fundamental fundamental part of that. I don't think we get to a future free from poverty without tackling care and the issues that it creates. So, for example, as I've just said, if you are caring, you're less likely to work, and therefore you have less money, and therefore you're more likely to be in poverty because of the historical role of women in caring. Caring is also less highly valued. And so whether you're doing paid or unpaid care, generally you are, if you do paid care, you're at the sort of bottom of the kind of salary scale for British workers. And obviously, if you do unpaid care, you are disproportionately in poverty as well. So basically, if you're doing care, partly because it's seen as women's work, you are generally getting less sort of money for it. And I think taken together, this means the plight of carers and people who do care is really something that's central to us. And that's why we wanted to apply some really sort of hard statistical techniques to really understand what does it mean to be a carer and what is the financial impact of doing care.
So you carry out the research, and what was the method that you followed to undertake the research?
So we've done a few different pieces of research in this space. So the first is called the caring penalty, where we looked at the financial impact that people face when they leave work to care. Yeah. So we found that unpaid childcare givers, so mothers, experienced a pay penalty of over £15,000 a year after just 1 year, and £21,000 per year after 6 years of providing unpaid care. So you have this long-term sort of tail of financial distress. And unpaid social carers also experienced a pay penalty. It's slightly smaller, but it's still really significant. So after £5,000, so it's £5,000 per year. And then after 6 years of providing unpaid care, that rises to £8,000 per year. So in summary, if you are a mother, 6 years after leaving work to care, you are going to be paid over £20,000 less than someone who wasn't in that situation. And if you took on unpaid social care, that's £8,000 less than someone in that situation. So that is a pretty big impact. And we used Understanding Society, which is a very kind of robust and long-running longitudinal data set, which looks at individuals over many, many waves, over many years, and looks at the differences in their situations. And then the next piece of work we did was to look at the transitions of unpaid carers in and out of poverty. And we found, unsurprisingly, that both unpaid childcare givers, so parents, and unpaid social caregivers, so unpaid carers, were more likely to enter poverty and less likely to exit poverty than the rest of the population, which feels very intuitive given we talk about how little money is often going into the pockets of unpaid carers. But it's really brilliant to see it sort of quantified so that hopefully policymakers and politicians can do something about it.
So out of all the reports that you've written and it's talked about, what are the recommendations?
So I think there's a few different areas in which government needs to act. And I don't think this will be solved by one sort of silver bullet. So what we're seeing is growing care needs across the population. We're getting older as a nation. That means we live longer. We also have more adults who are learning disabled, which necessitates very long care needs. And so we have this perfect storm of changing demographics, which mean we will actually need both more paid care services and unpaid care in society. And we talk a lot about how we increase the availability and affordability of paid care. There's a huge debate about, the Deal-Not reforms or what's needed to make childcare or, adult social care cheaper. But actually, we don't talk enough about how huge amounts of care will be needed, and they will be needed to be done by unpaid carers, so informal carers, parents, friends, sometimes neighbours. And we don't talk about enough about the systems that need to change to allow us all to do more caring. So the key areas where we need to start, number one, the benefit system. Not only do we need to fix carers' allowance and its earnings threshold, we also need to fix its adequacy. So carers need more money in their pockets so that they are at least prevented from poverty, which is not the case right now. Secondly, we need a new settlement around work. So more of us will be working and caring. And yet there is very little support for people who are balancing work and care. Labour have promised a few reforms which will make a difference, like being able to have paternity leave or parental leave on day one of your new job, or flexible working also on day one of your new job. But employers still have the ability to say no, and actually parental leave and, more importantly, paid care leave is just completely inadequate. And so what we need is government to put into place, what we called for was a statutory care pay set offer, which is basically like maternity pay. But if you are leaving work to care for, a loved one or a friend who's unwell later in life. And we think that's something that would make a massive difference. It would help people stay connected into work, but still be able to do that life-saving, important support. And then finally, I think local communities have a really important role in this. And this is a bit more radical, but authors like Hilary Cottam have written about how you can have sort of neighbours and local groups supporting people ad hoc, because actually care isn't just, feeding and bathing someone. Care could be going and doing a shop for someone, or it could even just be sitting and having a cup of tea with someone. We know that these are all things which make up care, and that doesn't need to be done by a paid care worker. It could be done by a neighbour or a friend, and yet we don't have enough structures to help some of that, more organic support happen at a local level. So that's, I think, something that local authorities, local communities need to be enabled to do more. So all in all, it sounds like a lot of stuff that government needs to do, but it's a really brilliant opportunity now. We have a new government. We have these challenges coming down the horizon. We've got carers allowance in the news. Now is the time to really grasp the nettle and provide a sort of whole systems reform to support carers.
Talked about in terms of recommendations, and you are seem to be open to Labour incorporating some of the recommendations. But has there been a public support? I mean, are we getting communities saying, yes, we are willing to go along with what Joseph Rowntree Foundation recommends?
I mean, one thing I really loved about the election was that people like the Lib Dems were so honest about their own experiences of being a carer. And actually, the other thing I'm really keen to see in public debate is just more people acknowledging that this is just a really fundamental part of many of our lives. And for some reason, it's not enough part of the political debate, and yet is such a big part of our lives. So I definitely want to see more of that. I think Labour have committed to doing something about paid care services. So the National Care Service is in the manifesto. We don't know exactly what that will be, but one thing we're really pushing for, and we will be pushing for, is for unpaid care and unpaid carers to be a really central plank of that. Because as we know, actually the majority of care needs are picked up by informal care, not by paid care services. And on the childcare side, obviously, we're talking more about unpaid carers of adults. But for many people, they are doing both childcare and, care for their parents. They're called sandwich carers. There's going to be more and more of those. So what's really positive is that we have a settlement on childcare that will make childcare more affordable. And so at least on one side of the coin, people will be supported with, taking some of that burden of care away. But yeah, we hope that they will listen to us. And there's others in the sector like Carers UK, Carers Trust, who are doing really brilliant work in this space. And we hope that we can sort of build a sort of well of support for transformation in the space.
Thank you, Abby. For those who are listening to Debt Talk podcast and want to share your experience on Debt Talk, you can get in touch with me on X at yourdrdebt or email ripon.ray@yourdrdebt.com. Let me go back to my panel members to speak about top tips that they can give to professional listeners and campaigners, since there is a conversation about the subject since the general election. And let me go and start with Rory from Policy and Practice. So Rory, what advice would you give and what top tips would you give to the listeners?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first top tip would just be to keep going, to try and get as much publicity as we can to this area, because as Abby says, it's often a hidden part of society. The care that unpaid carers do is quite hidden that they do. So it's good people like Ed was sharing about it, and also the fact that some of these stories are getting into the Guardian. I think it's been 5 years since the Select Committee report first into overpayments in carers allowance, so it's been going on for quite a long time, but hopefully all the work that campaigners and people like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation do can get more publicity to this. Top tips, I think, as Abby would say, it's looking at caring as a whole rather than just reforms, sort of sticking plaster reforms. I think the carers allowance system as a whole is outdated at the moment. I think you need to look into, as Abby says, how carers are treated in the welfare system, in terms of rather than having a strict threshold for earnings, how do we make it more flexible for carers so that it's not such strict eligibility criteria on there, so that maybe people can just pop in if they need to care for someone for 6 months, they don't have to completely leave work. There's more support for them to get support they can when they're caring, and then maybe re-enter the workforce as well. Because as Abby says, the situation and the demographic change in our society is just going to make this more common. So maybe one of the areas that we could focus on is low cost options. One of these obviously that could be done is things like data sharing. So how we share data across government and how we share data to organisations to let people know the support that's out there. I think recent research that Policy and Practice did show there's about 500,000 carers out there who are not claiming carers allowance when they're eligible for it. And there's also other things like social tariffs for water, social tariffs for internet providers, which are very underclaimed, council tax support. So it's about sharing data to make sure that the support that is out there, people can claim. But I think there's a lot of reform to be done, and I'm looking forward to hopefully some of the change in there.
And finally, Abby from Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
Generally, people doing care are talked about, not talked with. And that's a real poverty of the debate, I think. Like I said, I think we need decision makers, policy makers to look in their own personal lives and see that they are not talking about a group out there. They are talking about themselves, their family members. It's a deeply human thing to care. And it's just a real shame that we don't have systems that allow people to care with dignity. And I really agree with Rory that there are low-cost options here. One of the things that we called for in a previous report was if the government can't promise paid care leave, well, why not create a right of return? So an ability to take a sabbatical, an unpaid year of leave, but at least have your job at the end of it. So obviously it's not ideal. It doesn't solve the poverty problem, but at least it means that you're still connected to work. And when we speak to carers, obviously some of them have been caring for a very long time, and being in the workplace isn't their top priority. But many do say, if this was available in the first years of me caring, maybe I wouldn't have left work entirely. Maybe I would have stayed part-time. And obviously that makes a big difference. So I think we can think creatively, but really we need focus. And that's something that this area has been missing. And I'm really looking forward to more people being interested in it.
Lovely. I want to thank my panel members for giving their precious time out of their busy lives to speak on Debt Talk on the following subject: carers and benefit overpayment. My next podcast is on buy now and pay later products and debt. Thank you for listening to Debt Talk podcast with me as your host, Ripon Ray.